4, 3, 2, 1. Houston is one of the last strongholds of conservative social and political philosophy in the United States. If you believe that, you may not be correct, and we'll talk about why next, right here on To the Point.
To the Point. Presented by Rice University.
Welcome. I'm Scott Hochberg. With us is Dr. Steve Klineberg, Associate Professor of Sociology at Rice University and relatively frequent guest on our program. It's good to have you back, Steve.
Thank you, Scott. It's good to be here.
You've been out doing some surveys, and from what I understand, you've come back with some results that may contradict the popular perception of what Houstonians are and what they believe. What got you into the surveying mood, and what were you trying to accomplish?
Well, it was partly tied into a course we were teaching on survey techniques to sociology majors, and realized that there had not been a serious, far-ranging survey done of Houston attitudes, if really at all, and the most recent was 1976. There have been a lot of surveys done, but it's mainly by political pollsters, who will you vote for in the next election, or by commercial enterprises about what underarm deodorant do you use. This was an effort to cover a wide range of areas, just to find out, how do Houstonians feel about the world, about how Houston has been changing in the United States.
Why do we need a study to do that? Don't we know what Houstonians believe? Can't you just basically walk around the city and know how people feel about life and about politics and about the other sorts of things that you ask them about?
No, of course you can't. I mean, you need to.
Why not?
You need to do a random survey in which a representative sample of Houstonians are interviewed, and not on the basis of who talks the loudest or who happens to be in a shopping center when you're there with asking your questions. And the only way to really find out is by doing a systematic survey of the sort that we did, in which we started with random phone numbers, and then picked a random person in the household who answered the phone, and we're able to get a fairly good representation of how Houston feels, and a chance then to compare the kind of impressions that one forms from the newspapers and editorials and letters to the editor, and what Houstonians really do feel.
Now, you covered a real wide range of topics. What of all the things that you asked about, what finding did you come up with that you feel is the most significant in terms of characterizing Houstonians?
Well, there is, one of the things that was quite striking is that there is a kind of Houston worldview, a perspective on the world from the vantage point of Houston.
Is there really, as the television station says, a Houston way of looking at the world?
Well, there is to a degree. And it comes out in a variety of questions having to do, for example, with, we asked respondents to rate a whole variety of different things in terms of living in the Houston area. The highest ratings were given to job opportunities, belief that this is a city in which there are opportunities for people if they want to work. One of the major questions we asked was an agree-disagree item. If you work hard in this city, eventually you will succeed. 81% of our Houston respondents said yes. They agreed with that statement.
Isn't that a sort of a normal? Isn't that the American work ethic? Doesn't everybody believe that?
It's the American work ethic, but it's an ethic that has been under major attack and facing a variety of different shocks in recent years. And indeed, in January, 2 months earlier, 58% of Americans as a whole agreed with exactly the same statement. 81% of Houstonians. So in Houston, at least as of March of 1982, remained somewhat sheltered and protected from the recessionary winds that were sweeping across the rest of the country. And that belief in job opportunities, a belief that if you work hard, you'll succeed, continued to be dominant in Houston as of March of 1982.
How does that sort of an attitude, how is that reflected in the way we live our lives in Houston? What sort of manifestations do we see of that in terms of how people act toward one another, how people run their lifestyle here? How does that set us apart in some way that we can get a handle on?
That's a good question. I'm not sure it does, except to this extent of feeling that the reason people have come to Houston and the feeling about Houston is we're here because the job opportunities are here, not necessarily because the countryside is beautiful, because the city has a great deal of cultural offerings. And so there may be, it may come out in a kind of laissez-faire, each man out for himself, taking care of himself. I'm here to make money, and then I'm going to go somewhere where I can really be happy. There may be elements of that sort that are operating. But the other striking dimension that comes out over and over again in the survey, as you say, covering an enormous range of different areas, was that on that dimension we may be more conservative in our beliefs, in traditional views of conservative. but on almost everything else, on attitudes toward women's liberation and the women's right to legal access to abortion, on attitudes about spending for poverty programs versus the military, on issues above all having to do with environmental protection. Houstonians are more progressive, more open to change, more supportive of new ideas than Americans in general.
Now, you said above all on environmental protection. Are Houstonians strongly in favor of environmental protection, and did you ask enough detailed questions to get past the initial, do you think we should have clean air sorts of thing?
Right. There was one of the most striking things. We had not anticipated that kind of concern for the environment. We didn't ask as specific questions as we would like to in our next survey to really explore that, because, as I say, it came out by surprise. We had 4 different questions that related to the environment. One of them was, again, asking them to rate a variety of elements in terms of living in Houston. They gave the lowest ratings to the control of air and water pollution. 67% said that the control of air and water pollution was either fair or poor. That was lower ratings even than they gave to police protection or to the cost of living. And then we asked another question was in terms of government spending programs. Do you think we're spending too much, too little, or about the right amount on protecting and improving the environment? 58% said we're spending too little. 6% thought we were spending too much on the environment. We asked on an agree-disagree item, if today's pollution control requirements cost more than they are worth. 60% disagreed with that statement. And then we asked, reversing that in the other direction, the extreme statement. We said environmental protection is so important that continuing improvements must be made regardless of cost. Really quite an unusual statement to make. 45% of Americans as a whole agreed with that statement when it was asked in June of 1981. In our sample, 63% agreed. Pollution control is so important that continuing improvements must be made regardless of cost.
If your data is valid, and if Houstonians have these attitudes, particularly with regard to environmental control, then why is Houston such, I'll coin a phrase here, an environmental wasteland? Why is it so hard to promote environmental activism? Why is that not a major thing that is covered by the newspapers, by the electronic media? Why does it appear that it's ignored here if everybody seems to have such strong feelings relative to the rest of the country?
Partly because these are not necessarily the feelings of the people who are going to be active and see, part of what's involved, of course, is that there are real stakes in the perpetuation of a laissez-faire system, and the people have not been consulted very much about how they stand on these kinds of questions. One of the things that the data suggests is that Houstonians would be enormously receptive to political leadership that spoke effectively to the need for control of pollution. There's part of the reason why there's such concern in Houston is because I think there's a perception, there seems to be a perception, that in fact pollution is a serious problem in Houston. And my feeling is that you're going to see changes in that area continuing as these feelings come to be known.
Abortion and women's rights.
Houstonians are more supportive than Americans in general in the whole range of changes that have gone on in the families. One of the questions we asked was agree-disagree item. The wife's career, husband's. Let me get to the exact wording of it. It was, it is more important for a wife to help her husband's career than to have one herself. 64% disagreed with that statement.
How does that compare nationally? Once again,
I'm not actually the other question, which was the identical one to one was asked nationally, was the one on that said a woman with young children should not work outside the home unless it is financially necessary. 60% of Houstonians agreed. 75% of Americans in general agree with that.
Now, when we're making these comparisons to the rest of the country, are we really being fair here? Are you comparing it to people who are living in big cities? Do we have you're a sociologist, is the urban culture different than the rural culture? Sure. And are the national statistics being weighted by a lot of rural type areas that we don't have in the city of Houston?
Sure, to a degree. So it's also being weighted, of course, by New York and Los Angeles or San Francisco cities that are presumably more liberal, more progressive in these areas than ours. Houston has, in general, been a kind of microcosm of America, and it is, and it's more interesting is just what the survey tells us about us as Houstonians, more than I think necessarily how we are different from other Americans. But by having that comparison, you have at least an opportunity to see, where do we, what is the national average answer, and it gives you a feeling, are we high or low?
Possibly more important than how we compare to the rest of the country is how do we compare with Houston of 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and I don't know what was available in terms of surveys then.
Not very much.
But what sorts of perceptions do you have in that way?
Well, we are becoming more progressive, I think. One of the questions we do have a comparison with was attitudes toward abortion, which was asked in identical ways as we did in a sample of Houston residents in 1976. And on all these items, we asked, a woman's right to legal access to abortion. If the woman's own health is in danger, 90% of Houstonians said yes. If there's a serious chance of defect in the baby, 85% of Houstonians said yes. And then on the least powerful item, which was, should a woman have a legal access to abortion if she is married and wants no more children? 55% of Houston residents said yes, she should have a right to an abortion as a method basically of family planning. And all those questions have been asked in 1976, and in each one of them, about 5 to 7% more support for abortion is found in today's population.
There are those here who would quote unquote blame these changes in perceptions and changes in attitudes on the influx of those damn Yankees from up north that have come down and corrupted us. Did you run any kind of a crosstab with the people who were new to the city to see if that was indeed a valid perception?
Only very briefly. That needs further research. We're in the process of doing some of those internal analyses. Two things about that. One was our surprise at how many people have lived here all their lives, or have lived here for more than 20 years. The average Houstonian, this is Houston adults aged 18 to 78, the average adult had lived in Houston for 15 years. 45% have lived here for 20 years. 17% were born here. And only something like 20% have been here for 4 years or less.
So you don't think they have a real significance?
So we were surprised, first of all, that we are not, even though there's been an enormous increase in the population of Houston, a lot of that increase came from annexation rather than from people moving in. And then as we looked at the qualities and the nature of the people moving in, it's a mixed bag. You have a lot of northerners from New York. You also have a lot of rural southerners and rural Texans moving into the city in the last 10 years.
So the influx isn't nearly as great as you might
It looks
perceive.
from that preliminary exploration of the data that there's not a big difference between the native Houstonians or the longtime Houstonians and the recent immigrants on most of these attitudes that we've been looking at.
Would it be valid to say that a lot of the people who came to Houston from the outside came to Houston because their views were similar to that Houstonians already held? The idea of hard work and getting a reward and all that follows from it?
They certainly came to Houston because this is where the jobs were for them in terms of what they were looking for. But you find not just highly skilled middle management people coming to Houston, but the less skilled people also coming.
More than half of Houstonians said it is fairly likely or very likely that we'll have a nuclear war in the next decade.
Yeah.
Was that a frightening finding for you, or did you expect that?
That was a question that had been asked of a national poll, and Americans on the whole are increasingly worried about nuclear war, and increasingly fearful of the kind of growing confrontation between the superpowers and the growing buildup of nuclear arms. And we were somewhat surprised to find Houstonians not only sharing that view, but feeling it even more deeply than Americans in general. Partly, I think we're a target. There's a sense of being on the, if there is going to be a war, Houston will get it. Partly, it may be what you're suggesting too. It's somewhat more audience, that's a group of people that are reading the newspapers, being more aware of the threat that the Soviet Union represents, that we represent to the Soviet Union in a sense, and feeling this concern about it.
As a sociologist, do you think that sort of attitude plays any significant role into how we run our lives?
It certainly plays a role in the enormous growth of the peace movement that has developed in the 1980s. Fueled by the growing concern that the paths that we're on are going to lead are not enhancing our security, there's a tendency to also put this out of one's mind and to not let it affect one's daily life.
We're going to have to leave it right there. Dr. Steve Klineberg, Associate Professor of Sociology, has been our guest. Thank you for an interesting program, and thank you for joining us. I'm Scott Hochberg. Have a good week.
To the Point is produced by Information Services in the Language Lab at Rice University.